Welcome back and Happy New Year. This is a new session of Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. And our topic today is Paul's letter to the Romans. Our guest is Jimmy Hoke. Jimmy is a New Testament scholar. He is affiliated faculty in New Testament at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, a familiar face to a lot of folks at Westminster. You've taught in person there before and occasionally around in various capacities. So we're so glad you've joined us. It's nice to have a friend, nice to have somebody who's local, especially when it comes to Romans, which is a little intimidating for a lot of us.
Yes. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So maybe to start, of all the things somebody could spend their time studying, why Romans for you? One of our previous scholars said some people start reading through the Bible in order and they start Paul with Romans and they quickly realize they run aground but so why Romans for you with all of its complexity and all of its history?
Yeah, I ask myself that every day, but some of it comes to that knowing how intimidating it was. I wound up writing my dissertation and book on Romans it was not what I planned to do. It was not what my heart was set on when I went into doctoral studies. But my doctoral advisor said, if you're going to write a dissertation on Paul, we need to do an independent study on either First Corinthians or Romans. You pick. And I said, well, I'm really intimidated by Romans, and maybe the wisest thing I ever said. I don't think I can become a Paul scholar and not at least be able to muddle my way through Romans. So let's do an independent study on this so that I can better understand it and never have to touch it again. But at least when I'm teaching, I can make it through the class on Romans, and feel like the rest is history. By the end of that independent study, I was saying, what if I wrote my dissertation on Romans? Because it has this immense history. But as I got into the conversation, I realized, especially wanting to bring a queer perspective to parts of Romans, that there was a whole host of things that hadn't been said that needed to be said, and seeing some of those gaps is what made me excited, of feeling like, oh, this is somewhere where I can really dig in and make a mark and not just muddle through it.
Yeah.
So what were some of your sort of preconceived notions about Romans, and then what did you discover, or what gaps did you find?
Yeah, I think my preconceived notions was it was just a really, really dense theological letter that didn't make a whole lot of sense, and it begins with one of the most infamous clobber passages against queer people. And so there was very much this sense of, okay, well, Romans 1 is there, and then once you read that, it's a bunch of theology. And there were sort of two pieces that I really discovered. The first was really seeing laid out in Stanley Stauer's rereading of Romans, the full theological argument that really reset and took seriously Paul being Jewish and coming from a Jewish apocalyptic idea, and really saying, if we take this perspective on Paul seriously, what are the ramifications in ways that make that whole argument make sense without throwing Judaism under the bus. But then seeing within that how Romans 1, 18-32 fit into that theology. And so a big piece that attracted me was then saying, well, I can't just write about Romans 1 in a dissertation about what Paul has to say about sex and not talk about everything else, because it turned out that Romans 1 is the beginning of that theological argument that is so much longer. And one of the things I very quickly discovered was you can't actually understand Romans 2-15 without understanding all of the sexual and racial implications of Romans 1. And so wanting to bring that perspective out.
Yeah, it's one of those places where you realize, wow, he really was Jewish, and he really was a first century free male, and he really was influenced by certain cultural blanket assumptions, right? Is that fair to say?
Yes. And yeah, influenced by that, but also drawing in on one of the things that I really appreciated was being able to see, oh, so much of these ideas aren't aren't brand new, but they're just in different pockets. What Paul is doing that we might say is unique is what any scholarly author does that is unique. It's bringing together a bunch of little pieces of Jewish and Roman culture and packaging it all together in a different way that is, both not superbly innovative, but also innovative in its own right, in the sense that he's not just repeating anyone verbatim.
Yeah.
But you can point to most things in his theology and ideas and say, oh, but he gets that from these pieces of culture.
Mm-hmm. So I had a weird experience when I was in high school. A volunteer in my youth groups had a sense that I was interested in theology, and this person said to me, "You should read Romans, because Romans will give you kind of a full theological analysis from soup to nuts." And of course, I think about chapter 4, I gave up. I was reading the King James Version because it was the only Bible I could find in my house. And I was just like, this is crazy. I don't know what's going on here. But there is this idea out here that this is somehow Paul's mature final word, whatever. But this is a letter. Can you say a little bit about what we learned by reading this book as a letter to real people with real circumstances?
Yes, and I think that's what makes Romans both difficult to read when you're reading it as a theological treatise, but I think that reputation of it being a theological treatise comes from the fact that Romans is really different from all of Paul's other genuine letters, because he's writing to an audience that he hasn't actually ever visited. So Rome is the only place he's writing to that in all of his other letters, he's very clearly, he says, I founded this church, I've been here. And so when he's talking to the people in Corinth, he's talking to them as people who have met him and know him, but also he is responding to things that they have written to him in correspondence. And with Romans, he hasn't actually visited Rome. It doesn't, at least from what he says in Romans, it doesn't appear they have been writing back and forth. He, in Romans 16, greets a bunch of people who he's heard are there. So the most he knows about what's going on in Rome is he knows all of these people, Phoebe, Junia, Prisca, Aquila, and others are there, and he greets them. But other than that, it doesn't seem like he is responding to specific things that he's heard. And so he's sort of laying out a lot of ideas we find in other letters, but he's paving the sort of purpose for his letter is really to introduce himself and his theology to a bunch of people who don't know them, in hopes that when he shows up, they will say, oh yeah, you're that guy who wrote to us, and we like your ideas and want to bring you into our conversation and support you and support your travels. But very different from other letters. He's not writing theology that is correcting or responding to things that he's heard or addressing their question. He is sort of laying out his ideas, but less as a this is what is right, and more a this is what I think is right in introduction, as an introduction to himself.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction for me. It helps me understand, why there is sort of so much theological heft here, while also understanding there's a pretty particular rhetorical purpose that Paul has in setting all this down. I'm hoping we can sort of return to something that you alluded to when I asked you earlier about, what did you discover? And one of the things that you mentioned was the connection between Romans 1 and the rest of the argument in Romans. And I'm hoping we can go a little bit deeper there. You named it as a clobber passage. If you could just sort of gloss, what do we mean by clobber passages? Why is this one hard? I'll confess I've been tempted to sort of excise this part from the letter and then just keep reading, but you're saying that's not. So I wonder if you can sort of draw that out a little bit more. How does that argument work? Yeah. If you could expand on that, that'd be great.
Yes, so a clobber passage is specifically, often it can be referred to any passage that is used to harm or defend, right? Like, so we could think of passages used to tell women they can't be leaders, or passages that enforce slavery. But most commonly, the term clobber passage was sort of developed specifically to talk about passages that are used to condemn LGBTIA2Q plus folks. And so Romans 1:26 and 27 contains a passage that says the men gave up natural intercourse with women, and women gave up natural intercourse with men, and produced shameless passions with one another, to paraphrase. And so it is the clobber passage of clobber passages against queer people, because it both has the most detail, but it is also the only clobber passage that specifically mentions queer women. So it's the most comprehensive. But just in 2 verses, and when it's read as a clobber passage, not that it gets a whole lot better when you read it in context, but it's taken out of the context of the full theology, which is deeply connected. So Paul talking about sort of a sexual decline, he is specifically talking about Gentiles at this point. So he's repeating ideas. Both we can find this in how Romans described conquered nations, which is the same term we use and translate as Gentiles, but it also comes from a lot of Jewish apocalyptic passages talking about the depraved behavior of Gentiles. And so Paul says the problem with Gentiles is they don't know God and they don't recognize God, and they're incapable of having faith in God, and therefore God hands them over to all of these uncontrollable, because they stopped worshiping God and started worshiping animals and other idols. God handed them over to all of these degrading passions, first talking about queer sexuality, and then moving into, and then because they were doing that, they became robbers and thieves and adulterers, and goes into this long vice list that then ends with they're all worthy of God's judgment, right? When God's judgment day comes, which Paul believes apocalyptically is coming within Paul's lifetime, God is poised to send the Gentiles to hell, and only those who have faith in God get to participate in God's justice. And so that is sort of the racialized ideology that Paul holds, is Gentiles are fundamentally incapable of this, and because of that, they do all of this queer stuff. And then Paul's big theological shift is to say, but Jesus provides a path to Gentiles to be able to have faith in God. So there's this sense of Jesus almost being the cure for Gentiles as a separate path, because of their fundamental incapability.
Where do we go with that then? So, I mean, because we've talked about Paul being somewhat radical for his time in terms of how he sees Gentile inclusion as the manifestation of the promise to Abraham. I mean, it's big. This is world changing for Paul. Yet he makes assumptions in there about sexuality that most of us would say we don't hold today, about human passions and human choice and what nature teaches us and stuff like that. You see what I mean? Like, so can we have the good Paul without the bad, or are we stuck with both Paul?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of yes and no, and not really. I don't think we can ignore the bad parts of Paul, because that racialized aspects of Gentiles, what I discovered both when I was looking at Romans 3 and 13 for my book and dissertation, but then when I had to write study notes on the whole thing, it shocked me every time I would be in Romans 7, Romans 8, Romans 9 and 10, and going, wait a second, this all goes back to, that's a coded reference back to Romans 1 about the racialized ideas of Gentiles not being able to control themselves. If you backslide, for Paul, if you backslide in faith in God, if you don't have faith in God, that also means you backslide into all of these Gentile behaviors that come with it, and that's threaded across Romans. And so it's really hard to take that out while also saying, but there is something really exciting, a little bit innovative, but also important to recognize in Romans, that there really is this 2 paths. That the other complication with Romans that I continue to grapple with is that theological interpretations of Romans have often gotten it wrong, and sort of presented it as this all-inclusive thing where everybody is sort of part of the same Christianity. And Paul, I really like the metaphor of a race that Paul uses at the end of Romans 9 to 11 and talked about, right, there was this race, and the way the apocalyptic idea had it was once all of the Jews cross the finish line and believe in God, God's justice comes. And so there's this small group of Jewish teachers of Gentiles, which which is mainly who Paul is debating with, is other Jews who teach Gentiles like Paul. And so Paul says, well, they all got it wrong, who I'm debating with, and they're this sort of remnant that needs to come to this understanding. And then once they cross the finish line, God's justice comes, but God intentionally made it so they don't understand things, and that gives all of the Gentiles time to cross the finish line. Then everyone crosses the finish line, and there's a big there's a big party. But there's sort of two different paths. That Jesus is the path for Gentiles to get them across that same finish line.
This sounds different to me from I think I'm, very used to reading Paul through the lens of Luther, right? And Paul saying law doesn't matter, faith matters. But this sounds like a different take on the full argument here. Can you kind of suss out for us the distinction there?
Yes, and this is sort of the big, and this is, I would say, the big thing where I went, it was both my aha moment for feeling like, oh, Romans makes more sense, but it was also my aha moment for saying, oh, and Romans just got much more interesting in terms of being able to write about it. And a lot of it comes down to the the faith in or of Jesus Christ. So in Romans 3 to 5, which is the center of Paul's theology, Luther and centuries of scholarship has translated this Greek phrase that doesn't have a preposition as faith in Jesus Christ. And so Paul is essentially saying, right, the way to salvation for Gentiles is through faith in Jesus Christ. And the Greek can also be read as being Jesus Christ's faith. So a possessive faith of Jesus Christ. And there's long been a movement among scholars to start reading it that way. And that shifts everything, because then Jesus Christ's faith becomes the thing that specifically saves Gentiles. That Jesus's crucifixion, God's action, it's not right. It's part of this plan specifically to save Gentiles, and it's Jesus having faith in God's plan instead of Jesus as the Messiah being able to say, okay, Messiah, that means God's judgment comes right now. Jesus says, I will delay my messiahship, be crucified, and that will make a little delay in time so that Gentiles have that extra time to get across the finish line. But it shifts fully not only how we read Romans, but how we translate it, which shifts how Luther was translating it, but also until a year ago, how the NRSV, so the updated edition of the NRSV, has changed from faith in Jesus Christ to faith of Jesus Christ, which really shifts all. It's one. I often say it's one preposition. It sounds super nerdy, but it's one of those times where you're like, it's super nerdy, and you can get in the weeds of it. But when you look at like how does it change everything, it really shifts and matters for this bigger conversation of understanding Paul's theology in conversation with Judaism.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a decision that gets proved or gets supported not by the grammar as much as by the overall view. What do you see this letter arguing for, right? How does this person view Christ?
Exactly. Which in my book, I have a page-long footnote that just cites all of the articles on both sides, because you can literally there's literally just centuries of people arguing, is it in or is it of? And it's about 50-50. The arguments are all there. And so like the final sentence was just, at the end of the day, it's a choice you can make the decision based on the grammar either way. So this is a decision that you have to make based off of a theological choice.
Yeah. What's the so we've talked about how this is a letter. We've talked about how There's a lot of heavy lifting theologically in this letter. We talked about how Paul's trying to gain the support of the Roman congregations. What's the mood, or what's like is there an ethic to the letter? I mean, what is Paul hoping? Is Paul just trying to say, I hope I passed your doctrine test, or is Paul also trying to shape the behavior of the folks in Rome in some ways?
Yeah, this is interesting because, of course, he doesn't know unlike other places when he gets to the ethical section of the letter in Romans 12 to 15 and talks about things. He has no idea what he might have little clues, but he has no real idea of what ethical things are going on. Different from, say, First Corinthians, where when he gets to the ethical parts, he's saying, concerning what you wrote, you said, this thing in First Corinthians 7, and then he moves to, and then you said this in First Corinthians 8. In Romans, he's not doing that. He hashes some ideas, some of which may respond when we think about Romans 13 to specific questions that he might be thinking of. Because when you're writing to people in the city of Rome, you are also writing to people who are sitting in the capital of the empire that has been colonizing and oppressing not only Judea, but all of the other congregations and areas that he's been writing to. But also when we look at the names of most of the people he greets in Romans, most of them would not have been Roman citizens and would have been coming from these colonized territories to Rome, either as immigrants or forcibly brought to Rome via enslavement. And so Paul's ethics are in many ways saying, okay, well, if this is my theology, where then does that play in? And oftentimes I say a lot of his ethics feel like they're trying to respond to some specific questions, but they're also, if we look at Romans 13 that says submit to the Roman authorities, it's trying a little bit, and oftentimes even Paul's theology sort of seems to, if not accommodate Roman theology, sort of try to align to Roman imperial ideology, imagining much of his ideas about faith in God and God's justice and God's empire coming feels very Roman without Rome, right? It imagines, okay, well, God is coming and God is going to be an emperor just like Caesar. And so then some of the ethics we see also often repeat ethical ideas we see in the present, that his ethics aren't necessarily trying to change behavior, but just reinforce behavior we already see people conforming to.
Interesting. So he's sort of adopting a Roman imperial model for ethics, but putting God at the top instead of the emperor. What are your feelings about that? How do you feel about that, Jimmy?
The subtitle of the title of my dissertation that became the subtitle of my book is Under God, and then it has a question mark.
Okay.
So bringing out this idea that Paul's theology really does have this idea of God at the top. And what does it mean then for people to be under God? But I think my question mark summarizes how I feel about it, which is to say, well, are there other ways of imagining this? And some of my work is really interested in saying not just how do we think differently if Paul has this more imperial aligned theology, but to be able to say, well, if most of the people he's writing to are folks who might be more oppressed and colonized under Roman rule, how might they have responded? And would there be people even in the ancient world who would have contested, who would have wanted theologies that felt more egalitarian?
Yeah. It's also helpful for me just to know that sort of context of the particular people that Paul is addressing in Rome, to think about Romans 13 and what it means. I mean, he's not writing to people who are, eligible for posts in the Roman administration, right? Like, this is a sort of how to get along until we have this swap out for God really fully coming into being in power, right? Like, this is not supporting the emperor or the king. It's sort of living within. Is that right? I mean, I just feel like this passage can get us into a lot of trouble and can be
Yeah.
used, as sort of a justification for political power wielded in a certain way.
Yeah, I think there's both, right? There's both that sense of, okay, wait, there's two ways of reading it, and one that I probably lean less towards, but I think is valid, is right, that idea of Paul is just waiting for right, if you're waiting for the apocalypse to come tomorrow, right, there's no reason to rebel today. And I think there's certainly a little bit of that in Paul, but I think there's also a sense where, especially Romans 13:3 talks about not just accommodating to Rome, but really wanting Rome's praise. Right, there are some specific words Paul uses that actually seems to ultimately want, especially in the ways that a lot of his ideas about sexuality and other ethics seem to want to align themselves with Rome, where there's a subtle way he's also trying to say, look, if we do this, we'll also be able to rise to the top. And some of my reason for wanting to take that seriously and not just say, well, Paul would be anti-empire, but he doesn't want to get caught, is all of the ways that Romans has been read and continues to be part of, right? Continues to be part of an ongoing Christian empire, right? That in many ways, Roman begins part of a project in complex ways, but we can say, well, what does it mean that this ultimately becomes a text that doesn't just accommodate to empire, but does it in a way that makes it non-threatening to empire, so that Christianity can, in less than 300 years, become the religion of that same empire.
This makes me think about Paul's predilection for using slavery and freedom language. And so Romans has got probably some of his strongest statements about having been enslaved to sin, and everybody is literally under sin, or sometimes translated under the power of, and the result instead through Christ is freedom. And so I know some people who find that language of enslavement to sin really powerful because it matches their own experiences and some of their own struggles in life. But of course, that language of enslavement is really difficult. There's an understatement in a lot of Western nations, right, where literal chattel slavery is part of our history and still part of a wound that we're trying or not trying to heal. So, I mean, how do we rescue, or not rescue is the wrong word, maybe. How do we deal with some of those metaphors with Paul? Like, there's certainly a handle with care aspect, or would we want to rewrite those, or how do we negotiate that strangeness and problematic aspect? That makes sense?
I was going to say, I'd love to rewrite them, right? Because I think the first thing to recognize, right, with all of Paul, right, like, even when Paul uses metaphors of enslavement in ways that are trying to draw on it, it's recognizing, right, Paul is using these metaphors as someone who has never himself been enslaved. And yet he is writing to an audience where we know there are people who were, who either were still enslaved or at some point had been enslaved, because we know from the names that Paul names that some of these are names. And indeed, the person who is actually literally writing the letter to the Romans, is an enslaved man, Tertius. Paul says, and Tertius, who's writing the letter as an enslaved scribe for me, sends greetings. And so recognizing we don't have the voices of how people might have responded. But in 1 Corinthians, we have a sense where Paul seems to be arguing. Paul makes a really similar metaphor, and it seems like he is arguing with a faction in Corinth that might be arguing, if Galatians 3:28 says there is no longer slave nor free, then that means this assembly should be liberating all of the enslaved people. Because the only way there can be no longer slave nor free is if everybody is free. And Paul seems to backtrack there and use the metaphor of slavery to sin. Well, aren't we all enslaved to sin, and won't we all be free in Jesus? That when I taught that, it often feels like it has an all lives matter kind of problematic phrasing. And so being able to name that and see how that also creeps out in how Paul uses this metaphor of slavery to make it apply to all people, while recognizing it certainly doesn't apply to him. And then being able to say this is problematic, but it can help us see the ways Christians today are often using the same kinds of logic to talk about social issues.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm sure Margaret has one queued up. If I know Margaret.
Oh gosh, yeah. Is this fair? I'm trying to ask sort of, okay, what of value, if anything, do you find in this letter, right? Like, what does Romans add to Christian understanding, even queer Christian understandings of who God is or who Jesus is? And if it's nothing, that's an okay answer too. But I'm curious about that question for you.
I was gonna say I have two. My immediate answer is because on a panel for my book, somebody said, "Well, should we just throw Romans out?"
Yeah, that's the question, really.
Or should we just throw all of Paul out because is Paul too monstrous? And my first answer is we can't throw Paul out because one, he's not always perfect, but he's one among many. And so part of my response is even if most days I want to slap him in the face, he's also our only window into all of these other folks who were right. If we throw Romans out, we're also throwing out Phoebe and Junia and Prisca, we're throwing out our window into those people as well as recognizing, Paul is part of a conversation, and when I find Romans a lot less troublesome when I can be angry at it and recognizing when I distance it from we have to base everything we believe off of Romans and instead being able to see it as a conversation partner that all of those folks that he writes to were in conversation. And so I imagine Tryphena and Tryphosa, who Paul greets, and scholars have argued as a queer couple, when they hear Romans 1:26-27, I imagine them hearing that and just like passionately kissing in the middle of this reading in order to say, well, let's make it really clear before we even start talking that we don't think this is depraved Gentile behavior, or we might agree with what Paul has to say about Gentiles being having faith, being able to follow Christ's faith, but that doesn't mean we believe that our sexual arrangements are part of what we needed Jesus for. So it's that insight, but also I think I found a lot more once I read it outside of some of the misreadings that Luther did, and of being able to say there's a lot of really interesting things when we see this two paths, where Paul is only writing to Gentiles and saying this is how you get this is how you get to the party. But what I struggle with is there are pieces of that theology I find really, really exciting. And what I still grapple with is what do we do when that ship has long sailed, because we now have both two very separate religious groups in Judaism and Christianity, but also there's a fundamental aspect of saying there's something really powerful in this, and also it all rests on the fact that Paul was wrong, because Paul not about all of the theology pieces, but everything Paul wrote, is very much assuming 50, right? He's not writing for people 2,000 years from now. And so I find an interest in continuing to say, well, what about some of the things I like about Paul? How do we adapt those, knowing that none of this works 2,000 years later when we're not expecting Jesus to come tomorrow afternoon.
Right. This is fascinating. I wish we had more time to dig into the book and give it what it deserves. But, when you're at Westminster, hopefully people will pull you aside and ask you more questions.
Yes. Absolutely. Anytime.
Yeah. Thank you, Jimmy, for your time and your wisdom.
Thanks, y'all.